I grew up in a small town in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't so much as a Target, let alone anything interesting for a teenager like myself to spend their days. So when my dad told me we would be going on a trip to a campsite, I jumped on board immediately. It would only be myself and my dad. My mom had passed away 5 years ago. You see, my mom had died whilst hiking in the woods. We never found her body, but a knife had been found at the scene with her blood on it. The police confirmed she had been murdered. They managed to catch the criminal who killed her. I didn't know who the murderer was, nor why they did it. I was still traumatized from it. I missed her every day. But I was still beyond excited. I loved my dad, and I was looking forward to a weekend away with him. But before I dive into this creepy story, make sure you like and subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any more creepy content. We packed our bags, hopped in the car, and started driving. My dad never told me where we were going. He said it would be a surprise. I was just happy to get out of the house. We drove and drove for what seemed like days, but was probably only a few hours. Eventually, we reached the campsite. I wrinkled my nose as we stepped out of the car. The cabin where we were going to be staying at was all run down and derelict. I was surprised it was still standing. Its wood seemed infested with termites. "Do we really have to stay here?" I asked my dad. He ruffled my hair. "Come on, sport. It isn't that bad," he chuckled. It looked pretty bad to me, but I kept my mouth shut, and we brought our things into the cabin. Then something strange happened. My dad was back in the cabin, unpacking our bags, and he asked me to grab a blanket from the trunk. As I made my way back to the car, I felt someone move behind me. I turned around to find this woman standing in front of me, eyes bulging in their sockets, staring me dead in the face. She was wearing what seemed to be an old jumpsuit, orange in color. Was she a prisoner? "Can I help you?" I asked nervously. She just kept staring at me. Then she opened her mouth. "Is he here?" she asked in a shaky voice. I didn't understand her question, so I didn't reply. She took a step forward and I freaked out. I sprinted into the cabin, shutting the door with a bang. I peeked out through the curtains, watching her cautiously. She hadn't moved from the spot. She was just standing there. A wooden board creaked behind me and I jumped. I whirled around only to find it was just my dad. "What is it?" he asked, worried. I explained to him about the young woman and how she was wearing the clothes of a prisoner. After my panicked story, my dad just blinked at me. He didn't seem fazed at all. Then he asked me where she was. I was confused, but I pointed out the window to where the woman was still standing. As he peeked through the curtains, I thought I saw something change in his gaze. He looked different to the man who had raised me. His cheery expression seemed to melt away into something unrecognizable. But then the expression disappeared and he turned back to me, calmly. "Oh, don't worry about her," he said. My dad moved from the window, humming as he stepped into the kitchen. "Do you want something to eat?" he asked me as if nothing had happened. I was still so confused. Why had my dad not reacted the same way? There was a prisoner outside our cabin, possibly an escapee. She could be dangerous. We really should call the police. But so far as my dad was concerned, we were fine. I didn't understand any of it. This was supposed to be a nice holiday with my dad, but it had turned into something way scarier. And my dad was acting so strange. I didn't want to be a crybaby, but I wanted to go home. It wasn't until the next morning that things got really strange. I'm usually a late sleeper, so when I heard my dad get up that morning, I didn't think much of it. That is, when I looked at the clock and realized it was 6 a.m. That was really early for my dad. Curious, I followed him downstairs and glanced out the window. There was the crazy woman again, the prisoner, and I felt my jaw drop as I realized she was speaking to my dad. They chatted like they'd known each other for years. My dad had some food with him, and he gave it to the woman. I couldn't believe my eyes. She was a prisoner. What was my dad doing? When my dad returned, I decided to confront him about it. "Why are you talking to that woman?" I demanded. "Can't you see she's a criminal?" My dad was shocked to find out I had seen everything, but he calmed down. "Josh, there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" My dad took a deep breath. I'm in love with her. I took a step back. What? I'm in love with that woman, he repeated. Look, after your mother died, I've been lonely. I met Sharon and I fell in love. But she got mixed up in some bad business and now she's on the run and I have to help her. I have to. I couldn't believe what my ears were telling me. Was my dad losing it? But Dad, why didn't you ever tell me about her? I asked. Because I thought you would get mad. I didn't want you to think Sharon was replacing your mom. But Dad, she's a criminal. We can't help her. Please, Josh, I'm in love with her. Just do this for me, please. I hesitated. Logic told me this was a bad idea. She was a criminal for God's sake. But the look on my dad's face made me think again. Fine, I said. My dad breathed a sigh of relief. I glanced at him. Is this the reason why we went camping? My dad looked apologetic. Yes, sorry about that, son, but Sharon needs me. I sighed. Fine, let's just get through this. Dad went outside and called the prisoner Sharon in. She appeared at the door and she glanced at me awkwardly. Then, to my surprise, she rushed in and hugged me. I've heard so much about you, Josh, she said. I patted her back awkwardly. Hello, Sharon. For the next few days, she stayed hiding in our cabin. Dad said we just needed to lie low for a few days, but then we could return back home and Sharon could come with us. I wasn't so keen on the idea, but I could tell it made Dad happy, so I went along with it. Before long, the weekend was over and we were driving back home, but this time with Sharon. I was unsure what Dad planned on doing when we got back to cover up Sharon's strange appearance, but I was sure he'd figure it out. For many weeks, we lived together pretty fine. If I was completely honest, I didn't like Sharon. She was way too loud and always made comments about how messy my room was. But as long as Dad was happy, I could put up with her. I started to get curious about what Sharon had done to get her arrested. One day I asked her. Dad was out in the garden tending to his plants, and Sharon and I were in the kitchen. Sharon, I said, can I ask, why were you arrested? Sharon smiled, but she looked so creepy to me. Murder. I felt my heart drop. What? Yeah, said Sharon casually, but don't worry, she deserved it. Who did you murder? Sharon looked at me and her eyes glinted dangerously. Don't you worry about that. She left the kitchen and sat down next to my dad outside. They looked so happy together, but I was terrified. I was living with a murderer. I was on edge for the next couple of weeks. I had trouble sleeping and I always left the room if Sharon was there, but Dad didn't seem to notice. Sharon noticed and she seemed to find it funny by how scared I was. One night I was sleeping in my room when I heard a noise. I opened my eyes and there was Sharon, standing at my bedroom door, just staring at me. I screamed and I turned the light on, but then she was gone. I couldn't tell whether I had dreamt it or whether it had actually happened. Then another time, I was having breakfast when Sharon appeared beside me carrying a knife. For some reason, maybe it was the sunlight shining through, but I thought I spotted blood on the knife. Turns out, it was just butter. I was starting to lose my mind. I didn't want to tell my dad, though. He was so happy, and I was willing to suffer if it meant he would stay happy. Ever since my mom died, he had been so lonely, it was true. At least Sharon made him happy. For some reason, I started to dream about Mom. I don't know why, but I always dreamed about what it would have been like if she hadn't been murdered. I remembered she was so beautiful, with her lovely brown locks of hair and her hazel eyes. She also gave the best hugs. I missed her so much. Sometimes, I would cry on my own in my room just thinking of her. For some time, living with Sharon became the norm. I kept to myself as much as possible, and honestly, I realized I was spending less and less time with Dad. Sharon always seemed to be with him, and I never got any alone time with my dad. Things were getting so miserable. I was actually half hoping the police would turn up one day and arrest her. I would never snitch on her, of course, for my dad's sake, but still, I wished for it more than once. I always imagined my relief at opening the door and seeing a policeman standing there, ready to take Sharon away and have everything back to normal with my dad. But then, I would feel guilty for thinking that way. Those were some confusing times for me. One day, Sharon and Dad went out for dinner by themselves. I was alone at home when I heard a knock at the door. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was the police, and I felt relief. I ran over, expecting to open to the grim face of a police officer, but instead, what I saw was someone I would never have expected to see in a million years. Standing there, with tears running down her face, was my mother. My mother! But no, that didn't make sense. She was dead. The police had confirmed it, and yet there she was, standing right in front of me. She was alive, risen from the grave. I was too stunned to speak. "Hi, Josh," she said. She stepped forward and crushed me in her hug. And I remember she always gave the best hugs, so I hugged her back. I was crying by this point, and I was mumbling incoherent words. She stroked my head, and after about half an hour of tears and loving words, we finally stepped back into the house. I asked her to explain to me what had happened. Where had she been? Why hadn't she come back sooner? She explained everything, but as she got deeper and deeper into her story, my jaw dropped lower and lower. It was true she had been attacked on her hike 5 years ago, and it was true someone had tried to murder her, but they had failed to do so. She had escaped them, but not without a bad cut on her leg. My mother showed me the scar, and I realized that must have been as a result of that bloody knife the police had found at the scene. She said that she had tried to outrun her attacker, but they had captured her and held her captive for 5 whole years. That is, until her captor had been arrested and sent to prison recently. That gave my mother the chance to escape, and she came straight here as soon as possible. "I've missed you so much," she cried, and we hugged again. "We have to tell the police. Can you describe your attacker?" I asked. She nodded, but then her eyes drifted up and her face crumpled. I followed her gaze and spotted a picture of Dad and Sharon. It was a portrait of them smiling and hugging. "That's her," my mother said. I couldn't believe my ears. Sharon? At that moment, the door opened again, and there was my dad and Sharon. Sharon took one look at my mother, and her face reddened with rage. "You!" screamed Sharon. My dad spotted my mom, and he froze. "Darling?" he whispered in shock. "Dad!" I yelled. "Sharon tried to murder Mom!" "What? Sharon, what is going on?" Sharon scowled. "Fine, yes, I tried to murder her, but that was only so we could be together." She turned to my dad. "Your stupid wife was in the way of us falling in love." I was stunned. "So you tried to kill my mother so you could date my dad?" Sharon turned on me. "Shut up!" My dad walked over to my mom. He cupped her face in his hands and she smiled. They hugged while Sharon screamed at them to stop. She told my dad to help her, to get my mom out of her house, but my dad turned around slowly and glared at her. "You need to get out of our house," Dad said. He put his arm around me and my mom, and Sharon screamed with rage. Without warning, she ran forward, her hands poised as if to strangle my mom. But my dad jumped forward and knocked Sharon out with one swift punch. We called the police, and Sharon was immediately arrested for escaping prison and for attempted murder. I can now say she is safely behind bars for a very, very long time. My dad and mom got back together immediately. My dad was so sorry, and he felt as if it was his fault my mom had been attacked. But we all knew this was just a terrible thing, and none of us were to blame. I'm so glad my family is back together, and my mom and I are now catching up on all the years we missed together. Life is good.